Everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Bethany Frew. I'm a senior researcher and group manager at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in this grid planning analysis center that hosts these powered by webinars. I lead a group called Price Signals for Grid Services, and I've been here for over 10 years at the lab. So I'm going to be talking about EMIS, the Electricity Markets and Investment Suite. I have a quick little note in the bottom left corner here that sometimes we refer to this as EMIS/AS, the AS referring to the agent-based simulation. So if you ever see that name, just know that that's synonymous when we say EMIS. That's what we mean. Want to acknowledge quickly before diving in that there's been a number of folks who have contributed to EMIS over the years. The current team is shown here on the slide with pictures, and then folks who have contributed in the past are listed by names. I want to particularly call out Nongchao Guo, who is joining us today and will be helping in the discussion portion at the end. He's currently our lead modeler in EMIS and has contributed significantly to model enhancements and analyses over the past few years. So really grateful for everything Nongchao has done. So why should you care about EMIS? Want to start with this slide looking at the independent system operators or ISOs and regional transmission organization RTOs in the US and Canada. And what you see here is that over the past few decades, these ISOs and RTOs have grown to encompass a larger portion. And in the United States in particular, about 2/3 of customers are served by one of these competitive wholesale electricity markets. What that means is that as we're thinking about future power systems and the technical needs and solutions that we need for those systems, we have to think about the market structures and the compensation mechanisms that are being used to signal for the investment and operations of different capabilities in our system. And in particular, this really gets down to getting the prices right, making sure that, again, those price signals are signaling for what we need across all of the different timescales, investment and operations. And what I really want to hone in on today with EMIS is kind of represented by this figure on the right-hand side, where we have this linkage between the market design and the price signals and operational outcomes of those markets and what gets built and retired. And that in turn impacts resource adequacy. So reliability of the grid is obviously one of the core pillars of our system that we have to consider as we're thinking about current and future systems. And so that resource adequacy, whether we're able to be adequate or not, can also feed into what the market designs need to be. These markets are very complex, and so there's sometimes out-of-market actions taken to ensure reliability. And so ideally, we can think about future market designs that can support resource adequacy and other reliability needs. And ideally, having that all within one sort of an analytical tool or capability would be great. And so that's where EMIS comes in. In the past, traditional capacity expansion models, which typically have been linear programs that assume a central planner that kind of sees everything in the system and they're minimizing for system costs and they have perfect information about the future, those miss some of the nuances and real world kind of details of how actual investment decisions get made, including imperfect information and investor risk. And so EMIS can fill that gap. It's an agent-based capacity expansion model, so it's a different sort of formulation than what traditional capacity expansion models are. And it has a detailed representation of the market design, as well as some of these other nuances that I mentioned, the imperfect information, the risk attitudes of heterogeneous agents, the preferences for which technologies those agents want to build, different financing parameters that those agents have, depending on the characteristics of how they can access capital to fund new investments. And it captures the interaction between market design, investment, and resource adequacy. So going back to that diagram in the previous slide, we really focusing on connecting those three pieces. To do that, we've integrated with NREL's Probabilistic Resource Adequacy Suite, or PRAS, and as well as the Sienna production cost modeling capability. There's a link that I have later in some of the slides. Those are tools that have been featured in previous Powered by webinars, so you can go back and learn more about them. And I'm going to talk in more detail about the different components of EMIS, but this figure here kind of shows at a very high level all the different elements and how they connect together. So we have the different heterogeneous profit-seeking agents because they're trying to to maximize their bottom line. On the bottom left, we have in the middle left the actual market clearing. So this is where the market is taking all the bids from the agents and clearing across the different market products. And then we have resource adequacy on the far right to assess the status at each investment period, but also inform the market design going forward. So really quick, what are some of the questions that EMIS can answer? There's a few that I've highlighted here, but there's a number of others, and we'll dig into example use cases at the end to help give a little bit more color to applications that we've had in the past. But we can answer questions about market structure, so the market design itself and what structures are needed for investment of resources to support resource adequacy of the system. So again, going back to that diagram connecting those three pieces. We can also explore how different market structures are robust against different system conditions, including different extreme events or different weather years that have climate change factored in, for example. And we can think about temperature correlated outages within the consideration of those years. So really trying to look at a broad set of system conditions to inform not only operational and resource adequacy outcomes, but the market designs themselves and how they're robust against those different conditions. We can also look at uncertainty and how that plays into the evolution of the system with the different market designs. So right now we focus on load growth, but in the future we could explore other sources of uncertainty like policy, the market design itself, fuel prices, et cetera, and how those impact investment decisions. So again, we're really looking at its core, a capacity expansion model. It's an agent-based version, but we're looking at how the system evolves over many years, taking into account the feedback of the market design and how that impacts resource adequacy. So I'm going to dig in now to that diagram that we had a couple slides ago and talk about these three different pieces in a bit more detail. This first piece on the left-hand side, again, this is where we have the heterogeneous profit-seeking agents. This is where we're predicting the prices and the investment decisions that result from those prices. So each investor agent is using a capacity expansion model that predicts those long-term prices for all the different market products that exist, and it's customizable, whatever set that you want, as well as the utilization of resources. The investors in these individual capacity expansion models consider different beliefs about the future. And I mentioned already that we focus right now on load growth, but you could replace it with other sources of uncertainty. And we reflect that uncertainty through different scenarios. So we're running this capacity expansion model for each agent times the number of scenarios that each of those agents want to consider to reflect those different beliefs and possibilities about the future. And that captures kind of the uncertainty aspect. And then the investment and retirement decisions take information that comes out of each of those capacity expansion runs and calculates an expected utility. So we're basically collapsing those runs down into an expected utility, which is based on the prices, the predicted resource utilization, as well as the financing parameters and risk profiles for those agents across all of the scenarios. And so just to give a bit more detail about these different agents and how that, and what are some of the dimensions that play into that expected utility and other investment decision related aspects. This table shows the current set of agents that we have. These are very stylized, but they're meant to reflect different categories of real world investors who are making decisions about what to build and as well as retire in the system. So we have a technology preference, and so this really just captures what types of technologies these agents will build going forward. There's a capital cost multiplier, which reflects an increasing cost of capital as more and more resources are built. So basically, this captures the idea that it costs more to borrow more money to build more generators. So that's what that multiplier reflects. There's a perceived riskiness, so this impacts the discount rate. This is effectively if a lender is giving money on both the debt and equity sides, if they're perceived as if the investor, or sorry, the agent, excuse me, is being perceived as a risky investment, they will have a higher cost of or higher discount rate. So we adjust that discount rate based on how risky the agent is perceived by the investor who's giving the, or sorry, by the lender who's giving the money. And then we have risk preference, which is a parameter in our expected utility calculation. And this just captures how risk averse each individual agent is. We also capture different project phases in EMIS. So we capture explicitly both the different phases that these projects go through and the lag time associated with them. So there's different decisions that can be made as well throughout that process. So there's a first kind of decision, which is this kind of orange box in the bottom left. That's the initial decision to kind of get into the queue to start the process of being built or being considered to be built, excuse me. And so this is a pre-construction investment. The resource then goes into the queue. If it continues, it will be built and then it goes online. And then at the end of its lifetime, it will be retired. Throughout sort of the middle portions here, the queue and construction and existing, there can be profitability-based retirements or exits of these resources. And this, again, kind of captures the real-world nuances that not all resources that enter the interconnection queue actually get built. And we capture the different costs that correspond to these different steps. So now moving on to the middle box in our flow diagram. So this is where we have the actual market clearing. So the agents in the previous step, the investment portion, are making their decisions about what to build and retire in kind of isolation from each other. They don't actually see what the other agents are doing. So they kind of blinders up in their own swim lane. It's not until they submit the bids to the market for each of their products and then the market clears for each of those products that they can then see the outcomes and how other investment decisions by other agents have impacted what they might have thought the market was going to be. For example, maybe prices were lower than what they thought they were going to be because other agents built more resources and participated and bid into those markets than what an individual agent might have expected. And so these, again, these markets are cleared based on each agent's bids, and there's a set of market products that's fully customizable. So we can include whatever set of market products to explore different combinations and different types of market designs and operational sequences that can impact these operational and investment and resource adequacy outcomes. So I have a list here. I'm not going to talk through each of those, but basically we've explored many different options over the years. One of these operating reserve demand curve, ORDC. I just want to highlight that acronym because I'm going to use that in a few more slides. And one of the more recent updates that we've done is the ORDC that I just mentioned. We've updated that recently to have a stronger connection to resource adequacy and to understand how different ways of shaping these ORDC curves can impact operational and investment outcomes. ORDCs are really just a more sophisticated way of capturing scarcity pricing for operating reserves. There's a curve that really tries to kind of more closely signal for when, as the system gets more and more scarce on available kind of backup capacity, the prices will go higher and higher. So originally we used a convolution-based method that doesn't account for chronology of resources. And our update changed to what's called sequential Monte Carlo or SMC. And this is where we account for the generator and storage unavailability profiles that feeds into the creation of these curves. And that accounts for chronology. And what's shown here with the sequential Monte Carlo or SMC in blue and convolution in green is that SMC tends to have lower prices. And this is because it's accounting for the chronology impact. So the unavailability, we see less kind of shortfall cases. So the prices are lower going into this curve. It's accounting for the ability of those resources to contribute to resource adequacy, where convolution misses that contribution. So therefore it has higher prices. This is just one example from one year, from one time actually of the year, from one scenario, for one operating reserve product. But the point that I wanted to raise here is that some of the details that go in, assumptions that go into creating, in this case, ORDC scarcity pricing curves can actually have pretty significant outcomes on our investment and resource adequacy outputs. And we're continuing to see this with some of the work that we're even doing now. These ORDC curves are pretty sensitive to the input assumptions, which is actually really cool. So stay tuned for more results that we'll share on some of our current work. And so the last kind of block in this flow diagram is the resource adequacy. So this, as I think I mentioned earlier, is where we not only assess for each investment period the resource adequacy kind of status of the system, but we can use those outcomes to inform different market products. So the ORDC curves that I just mentioned are one example. We also have a linkage to capacity markets. We could imagine future market products, some sort of special reliability product that we could explore also being linked to these outputs. And I flag Sienna and Praz both in this kind of red box on the right. We typically use PRAS, but we can use Sienna kind of in a more sophisticated operational representation. So there's different configurations that we can use for the resource adequacy assessment. And I know I mentioned earlier, this is the link I was referring to about the previous Powered by webinars for PRAS and Sienna. You can go check those out and learn more about those tools. All right, EMIS use cases. So I want to spend some time here highlighting examples of where we've used EMIS in the past and the types of outputs and questions that we can answer with EMIS. So far, we've applied EMIS to two different test cases, or sorry, test systems. They're both stylized but realistic. The first one is the RTS GMLC. That's 3 zones based very loosely on a southwest, or part of the southwest US. About 8 gigawatts of peak load. And we've also, in our more recent work, scaled up to an ERCOT-like system. This is 8 zones across most of the Texas footprint, and the peak load of the initial system is about a order of magnitude larger than the RTS, so it's definitely a bit bigger system. And the results that I'm going to show kind of capture both of these systems. There's 4 studies that we've published so far, and these I'm going to use as kind of the basis for the use cases that I show in the rest of the slides here in this section. There's a number of aspects that we've covered in these studies, including looking at the impact of different model assumptions like investor heterogeneity, uncertainty, and risk, as well as different market products and structures. I'm not going to read through this full list, but I'm going to cover a subset of these, and again, the rest of the slides in this section. So first, exploring the impacts of investor heterogeneity. So this is where we can explore having different agents that have different parameters and different risk attitudes versus having a set of agents that all assume the same future, all have the same risk profile, all have the same technology preferences, financing, et cetera. And so what we see here with the homogeneous firms on the left is that they all build the same amount within a given technology. That's because they have the same assumptions for what they're building. But if we have heterogeneous firms, not only do they build different amounts total within each of the individual technologies, but the types of technologies that each agent builds is different. And so this just shows how that assumption about having different investors can impact the results. And we are here again showing capacity in this figure. We can also explore different market products. And of course, this is one of the core motivations behind building EMIS is to be able to test different market designs and structures. There's lots of different market products that we've compared. I'm highlighting here a product that actually doesn't exist. It's a new product, and it's stylized in this case, but an inertia product. This is one that I hear a lot of, well, maybe we need to add an inertia product to the system. And so we played around with, again, very stylized inertia-like product, allowing fast frequency response from inverter resources to contribute. And so here we're showing market revenue. So this is where we take the price outcomes times the generation from resources, and we can show for each of the different market products what the total revenues were, which is what's shown here in this figure. And we're comparing different clean energy targets as well. And so I'm not going to talk through the details of these results, but we see that adding this inertia product, which is kind of the maroon brownish color, we see obviously increased revenues because of that product, but it also impacts the revenues because it impacts the prices of other products, including energy. And it's because we are seeing scarcity events that are occurring. And so I mentioned resource redundancy or potential resource redundancy here, and that's just because to meet this inertia requirement, you need certain resources, but then we also have this clean energy target, and so we need additional resources for that. So even with the inverter resources providing fast frequency response, we still end up with some shortfalls and potentially having more resources online in order to meet the combined set of constraints. We also can evaluate investor level profits. We talked about investor level capacity build out a couple of slides ago, but we can dig into the profit. So looking at the combination of costs and revenues for each individual investor. And here, again, I'm not going to talk about the details. This was looking at a case where we didn't have a capacity market, but it shows that there's a very clear delineation. In this case, you see the red and the black positive, blue, and yellow negative, but a very clear delineation between different investor types and how well they do in these scenarios. So we can dig into that this aspect in many of our results and show some more nuanced outcomes than we could see in, say, that traditional central planner capacity expansion type of modeling. Oops. There we go. We can also look at eligibility rules. So looking at what types of resources are eligible to provide or participate in certain markets. This example here is looking at wind, solar, and storage being able to participate in certain operating reserve markets, which can have a big impact on prices as well as revenues, which is shown here for the revenues. And so we also explored other participation outcomes, or sorry, cases, including participation in capacity markets and how changing the capacity value assumptions or changing whether those resources can participate or not based on different policy decisions, how those can impact the prices and revenue outcomes. We can also look at different clean energy targets. And I know we've mentioned this kind of in passing in a couple of the previous slides, but we found some really interesting results in one of our recent studies where when we start to look at very high clean energy futures, so all the way to 100%, achieving those targets in the market kind of operational outcomes requires having enough low cost clean energy resources across the different timescales. So here we're seeing kind of the left and the right, or sorry, the left and the middle. We have kind of our mid and high cases that are sort of our default. And we're not able to achieve, looking at the generation percentage here on the vertical axis, we're not able to achieve the target for our high case. So we're trying to get to 100%, but we're only about 85%. But when we reduce the cost of a proxy generator called RECT, so this is a renewable combustion turbine that's meant to be a proxy for many different future technologies that have a combustion turbine with a renewable fuel source, we can get really close to that 100% target. So we basically have shown here that absent that low cost option, we can't hit our clean energy target. So we can look at generation outcomes and some of these clean energy goals as another use case with EMIS. We can also, of course, look at resource adequacy impacts. And this is something that I flagged earlier on in the presentation. And here we're actually showing a resource adequacy metric, so the normalized expected unserved energy, NEUE, and comparing different market products. So in this case, different types of capacity versus energy only, as reflected by ORDC curves for the scarcity pricing of the operating reserves. Here we see that we don't meet our resource adequacy targets if we don't have either a capacity market or ORDC, but a well-designed market for either capacity or energy only can achieve those resource adequacy targets. We can also look at the operational aspects of those resource adequacy focused use cases. So here, looking at a with and without ORDC case, we have an output from our operational simulation or portion of the simulation. So this is normalized firm resource availability. And what this is reflecting is basically how much of the resources that would be committed in the day ahead are available in the real time for use to meet the load. And what we see is that with an ORDC, it tends to incentivize more resources being committed in the day ahead so that they're available in the real time to meet system needs. And this has been supported by a couple of other studies in our past where we've found the ORDCs, because of that scarcity pricing signal, that stronger signal it's sending in those curves, it's able to keep more resources online. So here, this is just to show that we can look at operational aspects as well as resource adequacy metrics when we're thinking about reliability. We can also look at different weather years. And this example is just looking at 2 weather years, but we see NEUE again here, so another resource adequacy metric. And we have weather year A on the left, weather year B on the right. And we're comparing different market designs within this figure. So the different colored bars represent different combinations of ORDC versus capacity market, or the two together. And what you see is that there's some difference between the different colored bars for a given weather year, but the biggest difference is between the weather years. So we can actually see bigger differences driven by the weather years than we can by the market design itself. So this is actually an area where we're doing some more work right now and want to keep doing more digging with richer data sets that we have here at the lab to better understand the impact of additional weather years. And finally, just want to call out some current work right now that we're doing is looking at multi-day markets. So instead of having the traditional day ahead passed down to the real-time market, what if we have an X day ahead market, a 3-day ahead market, 5-day ahead, 7-day, whatever, fill in the blank day ahead market, to start thinking about the impact of longer horizons impacting the decisions that we're making as we're committing and scheduling resources, including resources like especially including resources like long duration storage. So this is something that we're getting into now, and we hope to continue as well in the future. But wanted to flag that as another example of really an operational sequence that we're thinking about within the market structure. All right, so how do you access EMIS? It's open source, so it's easy to find. We have a GitHub repo. The link is shown here in the upper right. And I have a quick note on the left-hand side. There's different branches that you can find if you're familiar with GitHub. There's different branches. And the essay underscore analysis branch is actually one that's probably the most complete. It is based on the RTS GMLC data set, and it links to one of our more recent studies that's noted here. So far, we've only made publicly available the model with data that includes the RTS GMLC, so that's smaller to system, but we're hoping to work on additional data and versions in the future. Also want to call out on the bottom left, we have a link to our EMIS website. You can read a bit more about the tool and also see some of the publications that we've worked on over the recent years. All right, I think that covers it. So we will open up to questions. So let me get the question box here. Okay. First question, how are bids being generated for each generator resource? Yeah, so this is based on, so I'm actually going to go back to our flow chart because I think that might help with some other questions too. Just go back to this main slide. Yeah, so these bids are based on different mechanisms. So for example, capacity market is maybe the easiest. This is based on a going forward cost. So it's based on the investor, each agent's assumptions about what their future revenues will be for energy and operating reserves and if there is a clean energy market. So basically everything else that exists, all the other markets products, what are the revenues that they expect from those? And then what's the remaining cost that the agent would need to cover for that resource? And that going forward cost is what they bid into the capacity market. For the other resources, it's really based on their operating costs. So for energy, it's their marginal cost, operating reserve, same thing. We don't have degradation for storage yet, so that's one that would impact potentially the bids for storage resources. Right now, we assume zero. For clean energy, trying to remember, Nongchao, do you remember the clean energy? I know it's a supply demand curve based construct, and we have kind of an upper cap on that. That's for the clean
Yeah,
energy market. Yeah, I'm
I
gonna turn
think
over to
clean
you.
energy, yeah, clean energy is like it's also like of the same concept of going forward cost. So basically based on the forecast revenue and then what it takes to make up that forecast revenue for the rack bids.
Okay. Yeah, and we can also point you to the very first paper we published. There's more details in there. We could go read on that. Okay. Can the system accommodate nuclear energy, which involves very different investment scale and time factors than the renewables? Yes, and we actually already have nuclear in here. It's probably simplified from maybe what some folks would, might want to consider additional details. We have a set lifetime for that resource. All resources have a given kind of lifetime amount. But yeah, we do have nuclear. Again, if we think about the different project phases, we have the different construction times involved in, which is different for each resource type. So that's captured in there. So yeah, we included, but it might be more simplified than what others do. But yeah, I guess if there's follow-on questions to any of these, please just go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll move to the next one. How does scenario runtime compare to an equivalent non-agent based model? Do the runtime scale well? Great question. So this is something that, yeah, it depends, is the general answer to that question. Keep in mind that we're running for each investment period, right? So this kind of flow diagram here is one investment period, right? We're kind of looping through this and right now we do a 15-year investment horizon, but you could change that to be 20 or 30 or whatever years you want. So for each investment year, we're running the capacity expansion model for 4 agents, and right now we have 3 scenarios each. So we have 12 capacity expansion model runs that we're doing for each investment year, and then we run Sienna for the energy and ancillary services, and then we have these other modules that we run for the other markets. And then we have to run PRAS if we choose, that's kind of our default for the resource adequacy, and however many draws you want for the probabilistic part of PRAS. Um, so there's basically, it's like we're running lots of different models many different times. And then depending on what market structures you have, particularly in this energy and ancillary services, which is where we use the Sienna production cost model, that can significantly impact runtime. So that multi-day market that I mentioned at the very end, that has significantly increased our runtime because we've added a whole other phase to or stage to the Sienna model. So some of our runs right now take 10 days on our high performance computing facility. Previously, there are runs you could do in a 24-hour period. So I guess I hesitate to compare that directly to, say, a traditional capacity expansion model that isn't running all of these different pieces multiple times. Um, the capacity expansion part over here, where we're on the left-hand side, where we're doing the price prediction and resource utilization, those are within hours or minutes. So they're pretty quick. So yeah, I hesitate to it's kind of a it depends answer. But Nongchao, do you have anything to add to that that might add more clarity?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I think, yeah, in terms of runtime, like you were saying, essentially the runtime is not really like the capacity expansion itself, right? It's some of the market clearing pieces, like especially the production cost simulation pieces. So those can take very, very long. So it's not really an apple to apple comparison from that perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? I apologies if this adds confusion, but I just remembered I have a backup slide on the clean energy market, the REC market. So I'm going to, at the risk of messing up my screens here, I'm going to exit and go down to that slide. At least I think I have it. Here it is. Because I think this might help the question that was asked a few questions ago. I don't know if you guys, can you still see my screen? Yeah,
Yeah.
no chat. Okay, great. So this is an example, and this was from kind of our initial version. So this is our rec market. And this is where we have the short run marginal cost and we have a long run marginal cost. Um, and there's this ACP, this I think alternate compliance payment, I think is what it's called, but it's basically like a stop valve or kind of it's a cap basically on the price, the rec price on the left-hand side. So it's effectively a supply demand curve. And it depends on sort of the requirement, which is megawatt hours on the horizontal axis, like where you are in the system. So as you need more and more clean energy to meet that target, you're going to intersect with the higher price. Um, and then ultimately, again, if your supply curve goes beyond the ACP, that acts as a stop valve where it'll or stop gap. I forget the term. Basically, it's a cap. You won't go above that. So I hope this helps. I know there's a lot of acronyms on this slide, but I just wanted to give maybe a visual answer because we kind of glossed over this part a little bit more. Okay, gonna go back to our. So hopefully this works. Oh, great, it did. Okay. Um, Next question. How is the market clearing model? Do you consider strategic market bidding? Is the power system considered? Okay, so there's two questions here. Um, we don't consider strategic markets. So I guess I want to clarify here too. This is not an equilibrium model. I know that there's sometimes when we talk about like strategic behavior or thinking of multiple agents being involved in a market. There's bi-level models, and we actually had explored that when we first started building EMIS, kind of in its earlier phases. So we don't. This isn't a true equilibrium model, so there's no strategic kind of behavior or strategic gaming represented. So some of like the Nash equilibrium or Nash sorry, Stackelberg or some of those other um, types of models. We don't have that in here. The I guess the fact that the agents are kind of doing their predictions about the future and coming up with their investment decisions based on that expected utility and then the resulting bids into the market, they're doing that in their own lane without knowing what the other agents are doing. You know, they might be kind of bidding in a way that could um, I guess it's still not strategic though. So I don't think there is any really strategic behavior involved at all. Some of the feedback effects, for example, if like a lot of agents build storage and they all bid into the market with the storage and that helps to suppress prices, for example, they'll see the result of that once the market clears. But there's really not any strategic bidding happening. Um, we could do that. I guess we could. I know there's like the hockey stick curve with the small fish rule, for example, in ERCOT that we could consider adding bid markups, and that's something we've done in past work years ago before even EMIS existed, just using a production cost model. So we could think about doing that. It's not really embedded into the current structure of EMIS, though. So the second question, is the power system considered? Yes, absolutely. So in this market clearing, the middle step here where we have the energy and ancillary services market, for example, with Sienna, that's a production cost model. So it has, a full representation of the system, all the different operating constraints of the resources. So ramping, min start time, startup cost, all of that stuff plays into the market clearing. I don't know if that's enough. Nosha, anything else to add there?
No, I
Hopefully.
think that sounds pretty good. Yeah, I think in terms of the strategic behavior, yeah, I think like you mentioned, currently we don't have like the model itself. It's not like strategic behavior type of model.
Hmm.
But I think like one of the ways we can incorporate that is through maybe price forecasting, right? Because that is the main piece that individual investors will take that into account. So depending on kind of how those price forecasts are generated, I think maybe some strategic behavior can be incorporated there.
Yeah, thank you. Next question. Are you planning a North American-wide model reflecting different rules of different markets? That would be the dream. I would love to do that. We're kind of taking it one step at a time by scaling up to ERCOT. And like I said, we're hitting some pretty long run times when we consider these multi-day markets, for example. So we might have to adjust some other levers to be able to scale it up to a larger footprint, or perhaps, even just add additional systems, even if they're not, even if it's not a co-optimized full system, if we just kind of look at the different market areas separately, that would be amazing. So I guess stay tuned. There's no plan right now, but in the future, it would be great to do that. Next question. How many potential weather years are evaluated and how are those years generated? Yeah, so in the results that we showed today, and Nansha, correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe it's those all were just 1 or 2 weather years, so not a lot. The work that we have right now, which we're still doing the analysis, has 15 weather years. But we have access, and that's partly through the Super CC, Grant Buster, some of the other folks at NREL. If you've heard of their work, it's really really good work, coming up with some climate change adjusted, forward-looking data sets for wind, solar, and load. I think there's like 90 years available in total, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot more that we could tap into, but we just took 15 years of that because of our 15-year investment horizon. But absolutely, we could expand that in the future. And there's a whole documentation on the Super CC data that is available. I don't know if I can pull it up while I'm sharing to put it in the chat, but if you just Google NREL and Super CC, there is I believe there's a web page for that.
Yeah,
And Grant just
I'll
had,
drop it in the chat too. Thank you.
perfect. Yeah, and I think it was a Nature Energy article that Grant just had come out. So really, really good work that if you're interested in that, you should definitely go check it out. All right, next question. What are the assumptions around the price of natural gas? Yeah, so all of our cost trajectories, fuel price assumptions are based on NREL's ATB. I should have mentioned that. So the annual technology baseline, if you haven't heard of that, it's a wonderful resource of many different cost assumptions for different technologies and fuel prices. So that's what we've been using. And well, actually, I guess it's ATB for the technologies, and then it's the AEO, the Annual Energy Outlook for the fuel prices. But I think ATB references those. I might be mistaken. But it's largely using the same assumptions as Reed's for those fuel prices. We are a little outdated though. I think when we first built this, we pulled 2020 values, so we probably need to update that going forward. Yeah, but it's the ATB and AEO. If you go to our reports, we cite all of these sources. I just can't remember the details off the top of my head. Next question, nuclear. Do you or can you include dispatchable nuclear? Ah, good question. I think we could is the answer to that. It's just the settings that we would use within the production cost model. I think right now it's effectively assumed to be a baseload unit. We have done past work. I've actually worked on this with Mark Ruth in other projects, not using Sienna or EMIS, but a different production cost model. And we were able to look at dispatchable nuclear, but you had to come up with basically a bid curve, right? You had to come up with sort of what those resources would be bidding in and their criteria for how they would be dispatched. But if we had those parameters, we could certainly do that in this kind of middle market clearing where we run the production cost model. So great question, and maybe that's something we should add to our future wish list. Okay, next question. Markets are looking at 1 to 2 days ahead, while resource adequacy is long-term planning. How do you integrate these two, which have very different uncertainty? Fabulous question, and I think this gets at the heart of why we built this tool to connect these different timescales. In the past, we would have a capacity expansion model that would give us a given portfolio, and we would run that through a production cost model, and we could adjust different levers in the production cost model. We could consider even some of the things that I highlighted today, like the eligibility rules, the scarcity pricing assumptions. You could look at different bid markups. So you could look at some of that bidding behavior in the production cost modeling. But then you would kind of be stopped there. You would have the price outcomes, and unless you try to do some other analysis with that, you couldn't really say anything about what that meant for long-term investments. You could look at I guess I take that back. You could look at the net revenues, which would give you an idea of, so it's total revenues minus, it's total cost minus the revenues that you get from the operational outcomes. So basically your energy and ancillary services. But without having some sort of capacity market or these other kind of longer term markets, and without looking at your kind of capital costs. So whether you are, fully paid for or you have going forward capital costs that you have to cover, you couldn't really say much about the investment outlook aside from those net revenues. This model framework allows us to explicitly capture the feedback between those pieces. So we can use the capacity expansion model to come up with what might get built. We can run the model clear or market clearing to see how the price outcomes would look given different assumptions about the products and the operational sequence and what the costs are for different resources, et cetera. And then we can feed that back into investment decisions over many years. We can look at the resource adequacy within each of those, kind of the progression of the resource adequacy within each of those investment periods. So it's not fully co-optimized, and that's an important point here. We're not co-optimizing all of these timescales and all of these things at the same time, but we're able to at least have a mechanism for considering the feedback effect over multiple years with that investment horizon and resource adequacy considered. So the price outcomes in those 1 to 2 day, your day ahead real time or multi-day market outcomes are impacting what happens going forward. So I hope that makes sense. I guess Nongchao, is there anything else to add there that might help?
No, I think that looks sounds good to me. I think yeah, the only thing I was going to add, maybe you already covered it, is basically this kind of going back to the kind of the RA and the market design linkage, like we've been implementing. For example, like the resource adequacy results will affect like some of our capacity market parameter and ORDC parameters, and this will affect the market settlement, like whether on an annual basis or at a daily basis, depending on the products. So maybe that's the linkage where we bridge those two.
Yeah, thank you. That was probably the most important part. So thank you for filling that gap there. And I will say too, I mean, there's other products we could consider to even further strengthen that leakage. And that's something that's on our top of mind for us as well. For example, an explicit reliability product that we could even have, again, with a stronger signal. Next question, are there different stages in a project lifetime queue construction? Yes. Are they deterministic or probabilistic? They are deterministic. So where's right here? Yeah, so it's a set time for each of these interconnection construction project lifetime. Those are just based on literature. We pulled numbers and I think our first report that we published probably has the best kind of compilation of information for those. I don't have a summary table handy to show you right now. I think that was, yeah, different stages in the lifetime. Yeah, so I think that's it. And I will say there's a cost too, as well as the number of years for each of these. So based on, I think we pulled numbers from MISO's queue to as a proxy for just what it costs to go through the interconnection queue and kind of get out the other side to even start construction. All right, we'll go to the next question. I think hopefully we covered that one. Do you do anything with market power and strategic behavior? Yeah, so I think we covered the strategic behavior question already, and the answer is not directly. There's no strategic behavior directly captured in here. It's something we could add kind of in a manual stylized way to the bids that the agents are submitting to the market. But yeah, we don't really have that behavior and then the market power that you would be concerned about because of that strategic bidding behavior. We don't have that captured here. But again, I guess I would need to think about the market power one a bit more. But in theory, if we did start manipulating bids to reflect strategic behavior, we could do something to calculate market power. The three, what is it, the pivotal player or pivotal, there's a test that they do, the three pivotal player, I think is what it's called, that we could explore some of those tests, but that hasn't been something that we've prioritized so far. Okay, next question. Following up on the computational complexity, how does the runtime scale with the number of stochastic scenarios? Great question. And we haven't really dug into that aspect too much. I will say that in our current runs, the the production cost model is the piece that takes the longest. And I guess that's really with the multi-day. Um, And if you assume that, then these capacity expansion scenarios don't take nearly as long. I mean, like I said, I think it's a matter of hours, like a handful of hours for each of those. And with the HPC, we can do a lot of these kind of agent scenario combinations in parallel. So if we were to add additional scenarios and really maximize on the parallelization, I don't think it would impact the runtime much. Now, if we ended up not being able to tap into the parallelization and then things kind of became more serial in this capacity expansion portion on the lower left here, we might see an impact. But yeah, if we can do parallelization, it shouldn't impact it. Yeah, and actually this is something we've wanted to do more with, so maybe we'll be able to do that in the future and be able to report back. Okay, next question. My question above is specifically about the capacity expansion module. Oh, was that the question we just answered? Okay, great. Then yes. Yeah, if you parallelize, it shouldn't impact it much. No chat, anything else there? Was that okay?
No, that's
Okay,
exactly what I was going to say too. Yeah.
great, thanks. Next question. Do you foresee this as a replacement to more traditional least cost capacity expansion planning or as complementary? Definitely complementary. Yeah, and thank you for this question. I probably should have stated this. I started at Reeds when I first joined NREL and am a lifelong supporter of Reeds, which is our flagship capacity expansion model that we have at NREL and is a traditional least cost a type of planning model. And we answer different questions. And I think both are very important. Both are necessary. Reeds looks at the full US. It's able to capture a broader footprint. It's able to capture a lot more detail on different investment considerations. and how different interactions between those regions. But we're really able to dig in more to this market design question and into the impact of having profit-seeking agents making these decisions. And yes, we're not co-optimizing all of these pieces, but in some ways that imprecision or messiness, if you will, reflects the reality of how real decisions are made without knowing what's going to happen, and there can be recourse decisions. And so we capture that ability to basically, for these agents to pivot and to change the path they take to change these their decisions going forward. So it's a different flavor, and I think they're definitely complementary. And yeah, we get a lot of questions about what's the difference, but hopefully this webinar has helped with that. Next question. It sounds like the agents are not aware of how their bids might affect prices. Yes, that's correct. That would be the key distinguisher for me of strategic behavior. Okay. I guess I think of strategic bidding where you are like economic withholding, for example, and that's to be more in the market power category where if you're an agent and you own a fleet of resources, you might withhold certain resources to try to help push up prices, and then be able to come in with other resources to be able to tap into those high prices. I'm thinking in real time here. I hadn't considered that perspective. So yes, they are not aware of how their bids might impact prices just because they aren't aware of what the other agents are doing. They're basically positioning themselves to do the best that they can in the market without actually knowing what's going to happen. Nongcha, do you have any thoughts or reactions to this point? It's a really good point. I think Jesse is asking.
Yeah,
I might have
I
to think
think
about this some more.
you're basically, yeah, we're saying the same thing. Like, yes, like right now, our model doesn't, basically consider strategic behavior, which means, the decision they're making are not affecting kind of the prices, or at least they were thinking about taking into that account. Yeah, but yeah, it's kind of the nature of our agent-based model. It will take a lot more to kind of factor that into kind of either price forecasting or bid formulation or investment decision making. But right now, it's not part of EMIS.
Yeah, and I will say too, like, feel free to follow up with us afterwards. I can't remember, was our email address or my email address in the very last slide? Let me.
Yes, it should be listed on that.
Yeah, so feel free to reach out if we're like just
Yeah.
missing the question or not answering it. Some of these details are things we haven't thought about or dug into for like 5 years. So yeah, just feel free to reach out to me and I can get you connected with Nongcha and we can kind of huddle together and get your questions answered. So yeah, thanks, Jesse. I think I'm going to have to think about your comment here and what maybe we need to just define what we mean by how we're thinking of when we say we don't represent strategic behavior, what we mean by that more clearly going forward. All right, we'll move to the next question. What would it take to add reactive power and voltage considerations? Great question. Ooh, so now we're really getting into some additional timescales. I mean, that inertia product or inertial-like product that I mentioned was very much a proxy. That was this slide. That was so what we did, we used the results from an ERCOT study that showed how much inertia they needed for the system, and we scaled. Again, this is all very stylized. And this is documented in this report that you can find here on the slide. We scaled which I know this isn't totally right. Again, this is just, it was meant to be a kind of simplified, very stylized case. We scaled the inertia requirement based on the peak load of the system to the size of our system to say, okay, here's what the right-hand side of the constraint is going to be. This is the inertia requirement. And then there's an H constant for each resource. So thermal generators had an H constant. And then we looked at for inverter-based resources, we assumed the headroom that they had above where they were operating could provide fast frequency response, and that was like a one-to-one provision for the frequency support for this inertia requirement. So obviously we're kind of waving our hands at some of this here, but the idea was just, if we're thinking about frequency support and if an inertia is important, we could capture that. So the summary, what I'm trying to say here is that we use a very stylized heuristic. We didn't actually go do an inertia study to find out what the needs of the system is for our particular test case and update that each year as we're, adding more resources to the system. So I think to start thinking about a more rigorous representation of some of these finer timescale considerations and things like, reactive power voltage, we would need to go do some additional work with some power flow models, more detailed models to be built, even maybe EMT models. I'm not sure how detailed we need to get, but basically some of those other modeling domains to back out some heuristics that would be accurate for the systems that we're considering. I would love to do this. I will say, like the vision with EMIS when we first started, we've talked about multiple timescales throughout this presentation and the discussion and trying to tie all those together. And I think that if you go back to the Sienna Powered by webinar, Clayton talks about the 15 different orders of magnitude or different timescales that we have to consider when we think about the power system as a whole. I would love to be able to have ways to incorporate these types of considerations. And so in the future, maybe that's something we can do, but it would be a big lift to go and really get the requirements, so the right-hand side of the constraint, as well as what resources could provide the left-hand side of the constraint, and get those modeled. So what would it take? If you're looking for a dollar amount, I would need to sit down and come up with that, but it would, just from a level effort, it would be a big lift, but would be really cool to do. Okay, next question. And I know we're getting close here to the time. Can the initial price forecast curves for each agent be customized in a CEM? I'm not sure what you mean by customized. So actually, okay, there's a really important point here that I didn't mention earlier. You could use whatever forward price curves you want in EMIS. You could go out and buy, and there are vendors who sell these, right? You could go out and buy forward price curves. You would need to have some sort of idea of how the resources would be utilized in the systems, or at least in the portfolios that these agents are considering to factor into the the cash flow that then goes into the expected utility calculation. But you don't have to have this sort of capacity expansion on the left-hand side to generate your price projections. We're just using these as a mechanism to say, okay, for each agent, based on what they think the future is going to be and their financing parameters and their technology preferences for, scenario X, and maybe there's, however many scenarios you want for each agent, they can kind of consider different future load growth scenarios, or if you want policy or whatever source of uncertainty you want to reflect in those scenarios. We're using a capacity expansion model to kind of scope out across all of those different options and to help us understand what an individual agent might think the prices and their investment would be going forward. And then we collapse that down again using that expected utility calculation. So again, you could use other price sources. You just might have to do some other analysis to get that utilization piece represented. Nangsha, any other thoughts there?
No, I think that, yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Yeah, essentially, like you can replace the price forecasting with any sort of time series you would like to test.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Emily, can I answer the next question? Because it's going to be really quick, and then we'll wrap up because I know we're almost at the hour. So the next question is, do you limit the capacity that each agent can build? Or does this flow from the modeling? Meaning, what's stopping an agent from just building a significant amount of CTs compared? Anyhow, the answer is yes. We have, and this isn't a good point. We have a max cap for each technology type. And then this capital cost multiplier, it's kind of a way to mitigate against a winner takes all. So that if there's one agent who's really going to make out well with one particular technology and they just want to build a bunch of it, there's both the kind of upper limit of how much you can build in each year for each technology type. And then as that agent builds more of that technology, it gets more and more expensive to do it. So at some point, it's going to kind of deter them from building a bunch of that one resource. So hopefully that helps with that question. That was a quick one.